White judge laughed at black man's last name. 3 days later, he was standing before him. What happens when a judge mocks a black elevator technician's last name in open court? He had no idea that just 3 days later, that same man would threaten his entire career. What happened next left the Ethics Commission speechless. Samuel Quaddy gripped the folder with the kind of care a man usually reserves for sacred things: birth certificates, dog tags, old letters from mothers who passed too soon. That folder wasn't just paper to him. It held the proof that he'd done every single thing by the book, that he'd played the game the way they said it had to be played. School records, psychological evaluations, caseworker assessments, a letter from his employer confirming his steady job as a city elevator technician, everything. He wasn't there to beg. He was there to claim what he had earned, the legal right to be his little brother's guardian. Because, and let's be real here, nobody else was stepping up to raise Caleb. Not family, not friends, not the state, just Samuel. He'd shined his shoes the night before, not because he cared about impressing anyone, but because he'd be damned if they saw him coming in looking like he didn't care. He pressed his shirt twice, made sure the crease on his slacks looked military grade, and left the house early. Court didn't start until 10, but Samuel knew the system well enough to know it always felt like it was looking for a reason to say you were too late. He arrived at the courthouse and joined the line that snaked around the marble lobby, the kind of line where people stand like they're waiting for God, not justice. The difference being, God doesn't require a tie and a "yes, Your Honor" before deciding your fate. "Quaddy, Samuel?" a clerk called out, voice flat and practiced, like he was reading names off a list of overdue bills. No pause, no eye contact, just a verbal push through a turnstile of bureaucracy. Samuel stepped forward, and that was when it started. The courtroom was almost full, mothers with kids fidgeting in chairs, public defenders flipping through folders like poker hands, and tired souls waiting for judgments. At the center sat Judge Walter Higgs, slouched back in his leather chair like the very act of being there offended him. 60-something, white, with the expression of someone who didn't need to hear your story to already know how it ended. He glanced at Samuel's file, squinted at the name, and let out a short chuckle. Not friendly, not polite, the kind of laugh that makes your stomach twist, because it was meant for everyone but you to enjoy. "Quaddy?" he said, dragging out the syllables like he was tasting a strange spice. "Is that for real? Hope you didn't make that up to stand out." A few snickers drifted through the courtroom, nothing loud, just enough to make sure Samuel heard them. One woman looked down at her lap. A man behind Samuel coughed, into his fist or a laugh, it was hard to tell. Even the clerk cracked a crooked grin. It was a morning comedy show, and Samuel's name was the punchline. He didn't respond, because when you're black and standing in front of a judge, silence isn't just golden, it's necessary. Every word you say becomes a risk, every syllable a potential weapon to be turned against you. So he just held his folder tighter, spine straight as a flagpole. "You work maintenance?" the judge continued, flipping a few pages without really reading. "An elevator technician? And you want custody of a child?" He snorted. "Did you come to the right building, Mr. Quaddy? This is family court, not a community fundraiser." That one stung more than it should have, mostly because the man didn't even flinch saying it. He wasn't making a joke. He was stating it like a fact, like people who worked with their hands didn't have hands soft enough to raise children. Samuel stood motionless, and it drove the judge up the wall. Men like Higgs are addicted to reactions. They live for the flinch, the drop of the eyes, the quick apology. But Samuel didn't give him any of that. Just silence, steel, restraint. After flipping through a few more pages like he was searching for some smoking gun that said unfit, Higgs made a decision. "Hearing is postponed. Further review required," he said with bored finality. "You may leave." Like Samuel had just asked for extra ketchup, not custody of his brother. Samuel turned to go, head high, folder still tight in his grip. That wasn't just a legal denial. It was a public slap in the face. And Higgs did it the way he'd probably done it 100 times before, with casual cruelty that left no fingerprints. In the hallway, Caleb sat on a bench, legs swinging under him, backpack at his feet, untouched lunch still zipped in the front pocket. His face lit up for half a second when he saw Samuel. "Did you win?" he asked quietly. Samuel knelt in front of him. "No need for lies." "Not yet," he said, "but we're not done." They walked out of the courthouse side by side, not saying much. Around them, people who had laughed minutes ago now avoided their eyes. Funny how fast amusement turns to awkwardness when you have to walk past the punchline. Behind them, a clerk called out the next case, "Williams versus City," and Samuel couldn't help but think, ain't that the truth? When you're black, it always feels like it's you versus the whole damn city. On the courthouse steps, Caleb tugged at his brother's sleeve. Why did he laugh at your name? Samuel looked at him long and hard. This kid had already seen too much, been through too much. He didn't need pretty answers. Because his name is a privilege, Samuel said, his voice like gravel, and ours is a history. Caleb nodded like he understood. And maybe he did, because some lessons you don't learn. You inherit them. If you've ever worked with your hands, not in some temperature-controlled office with artisanal lattes and virtual meetings, but real grit-under-the-nails work, then you know the smell of machine oil. It's not just a scent, it's a life. It clings to your skin, gets into your pores, settles into the fibers of your shirt like a badge of labor. And on the lower mechanical level of Brooklyn's municipal complex, that smell mixed with rust and the hum of forgotten systems, that's where Samuel Quaddy found himself 3 days after being dismissed in court, like he was some errant teenager asking for lunch money. He was hunched over the third elevator shaft, the one that had been acting up since last week, the one that carried judges from their private underground parking up to the 12th floor, where decisions got handed down like favors at a private club. And yes, the very same shaft that elevated Judge Walter Higgs, the man who'd made a mockery of Samuel's name, his dignity, and his intentions in front of a courtroom full of strangers. Call it irony, call it fate, call it the slow-turning wheels of something that might resemble justice on a good day. But there he was, and of course, he was there too. The moment Higgs stepped out of the elevator, you could practically smell his annoyance through his overpriced cologne. The man looked like everything irritated him. Rain, gum on the sidewalk, small talk, and most definitely the sight of a black man fixing the machine that lifted him closer to power every morning. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Samuel's paycheck and had the facial expression of someone being forced to greet a dumpster. "What's he doing here?" Higgs grumbled, his voice thick with disapproval, pointing a stiff, manicured finger toward Samuel, who at that exact moment was holding a size 17 wrench and trying real hard not to react. "Maintenance, sir. System flagged an error last night," replied the site supervisor, speaking in that low, cautious tone people use when they're trying not to wake a sleeping bear. The judge narrowed his eyes. Recognition hit him like a late bill. "Quaddy, of course. That name," he muttered, curling his lips into that familiar smirk. "Now you're fixing elevators. That's progress, huh?" Samuel didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He didn't say a word, because he'd learned long ago that sometimes silence speaks louder than indignation. Silence in the right hands becomes armor. Words can be twisted, but silence holds its ground. But someone else decided to speak. "He's not the only one you mock." The voice came from behind, firm and weathered, like gravel smoothed by years of walking through fire. Samuel turned. A man in his 50s stood there, dressed in a navy blue maintenance uniform. His ID tag read Larry Gibson, Engineering Systems Supervisor. "And who are you supposed to be?" Higgs barked, clearly unamused. Larry didn't flinch. He took a single step forward, jaw locked like a man who'd carried truth too long to keep it quiet. "I'm the guy who's heard you call the janitor a diversity display. I'm the one who watched you laugh and say, black folks shouldn't be above the second floor unless they're in security uniforms. You say it like a joke. But we know you mean it." The judge froze. Not in fear, but in offense. In disbelief that someone beneath him would dare talk like that. It wasn't the accusation that stunned him. It was the audacity. Samuel just stood there, wrench in hand, heart beating like a drum under his overalls. He wasn't smiling, but something was shifting in his chest. A recognition, a signal. "You got proof?" he asked Larry quietly. Larry didn't hesitate. "I got it all. Paperwork, witnesses, even a flash drive. One of the recordings? It's him screaming at the archives guy for being too dark for paperwork." They didn't go to HR. They didn't call a lawyer. Number. They did what working-class black folks have done for decades when the system ain't made for them. They met in the only quiet space left, an old supply room behind the boiler, with a busted fan and a squeaky folding chair. Samuel held the folder in his hands. This one was different from the one he'd brought to court. That one was filled with hope. This one was filled with truth, and it was heavier. Inside, complaints that had been dismissed, internal memos ignored, employee statements that were buried under bureaucratic red tape. Each sheet of paper, a voice that had been silenced. Each document, a story. "You want to know why we've been quiet?" Larry said, his voice low, steady. "Because we're black. Because we don't have titles. Because we can't afford to lose jobs we barely survive on. That's why." Samuel looked him straight in the eye. "You want to know why I'm not quiet anymore? Because I finally realized I ain't the only one." The next morning, Samuel started knocking on doors. No clipboard, no lawyer, just a folder and a mission. He went to the elevator mechanics, the night janitors, the cafeteria staff, the receptionists, everyone Higgs had walked past like they were background noise, and one by one they stood up. "I heard it. I'll sign. I saw it. I'll sign. I knew it. I'll sign." Some of them were scared. One security guard whispered, looking over his shoulder, "If he finds out, I'll get fired. I got 2 kids." And then he signed anyway. A woman from payroll brought a printed email. The judge had written a complaint once, claiming there were too many ethnic faces in the holiday newsletter group photo. She handed it over without a word. By Friday morning, Samuel had 13 signatures, a full audio file, 3 videos, and more documented stories than the office had ever acknowledged. He placed it all into a plastic envelope, sealed it tight, and walked, deliberately, without a rush, without hesitation, into the New York State Commission on Judicial Conduct. The man behind the reception desk looked up, glanced at the envelope, then at the name on the intake form. "Samuel Quaddy?" "Yes," Samuel said. The man raised an eyebrow. "Is this a prank?" Samuel squinted, set the envelope down firmly, and replied, "Number, it's the end of theirs." Samuel Quaddy didn't walk into the New York State Judicial Conduct Commission's hearing room like a man looking for attention. He wasn't dressed to impress, and he didn't carry himself like someone trying to play politics. Number, he stepped into that room exactly as he was. Calloused hands, stiff shoulders, wearing the same dark blue work jacket he wore every day while fixing elevators across Brooklyn. The same boots that had seen more grime than a subway tunnel. But today, instead of a wrench, his hands held something far more dangerous to the powerful, a thick folder packed with names, signatures, testimonies, complaints, and hard evidence. There were only 3 people on the commission panel. One was a retired judge whose half-moon glasses seemed to balance perfectly on a nose that had seen decades of indifference. Next to him sat a woman from the Civil Rights Bureau, sharp-eyed, lips pressed together like she'd seen too much to be surprised anymore. And beside her, a young attorney with nervous fingers, constantly flipping a pen between his knuckles like it was a baton he didn't want to drop. It looked like a courtroom. It sounded like a courtroom. But Samuel knew better. This wasn't a court. This was a test. A test of whether truth had any place left in the institutions built to pretend it mattered. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't look around for approval. He just stepped up to the microphone and began. "My name is Samuel Quaddy," he said, slow and steady. Yes, that Quaddy, the name that made Judge Higgs laugh. A pause settled over the room. Heavy, no shuffling, no coughing, just the rhythmic click of the young lawyer's pen hitting the desk in a slow, hollow tap. "I'm not here to get an apology," Samuel continued. "I don't need his words. I need this commission to finally see his actions." With that, he laid the folder on the desk like it was a brick meant to break through silence. Inside were letters from staffers, signed complaints from janitors and maintenance workers, transcripts of what they had endured, and yes, audio clips, even video. One in particular where Higgs can be heard calling a black legal intern a little too sun-soaked for law. Samuel's voice didn't rise. It didn't crack. It stayed firm. Because when you've had to fight just to be heard, you learn to speak like your words are chisels, not fists. "We all know what racism looks like when it's loud, but this ain't that," he said. "This is the kind that wears a robe, the kind that sits behind a bench and tells itself it's fair, even as it guts your dignity one laugh at a time." The commission didn't interrupt. They didn't nod. They didn't object. They listened, which for people in their positions was rare enough to feel almost revolutionary. "You want to know why I stayed after that courtroom hearing?" Samuel asked, softer now. "Because when he laughed at my name, I realized he wasn't laughing just at me. He was laughing because he's used to people like me walking away. People with names he can't pronounce. Skin he won't respect. Stories he won't hear. He thinks we stay silent. He expects it. And that's when I knew I had to be the one to break that pattern." When he finished, the folder sat unopened before them. Not because they weren't going to read it, but because they already knew. It mattered. 2 days later, it was Judge Walter Higgs who walked into that same room. Only this time, he wasn't behind a bench. He was in the hot seat, facing the same panel that had heard Samuel. No robe, no elevated seat. Just a man in a tailored suit trying real hard not to look out of control. His hands were clasped. His face was tight. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't look like someone who owned the room. The woman from the Civil Rights Bureau opened the file. "Judge Higgs," she said, voice like tempered steel. "We've received a series of documented complaints supported by audio and video evidence. They suggest a pattern of verbal discrimination, racial bias, and systemic degradation of staff under your jurisdiction. Would you like to respond?" Higgs shifted in his seat, coughed, looked briefly towards Samuel, who sat in the front row, eyes locked on him. "It's a misunderstanding," Higgs muttered. People tend to exaggerate, especially when they feel overlooked. Especially black people? The woman cut in, cold and precise. You've been quoted using the phrase, the imaginative oppressed. Is that your terminology? Higgs opened his mouth, but the young attorney leaned forward. We have recordings of you referring to an employee as a quota decoration judge. Are you suggesting that was also a misunderstanding? That was a joke, Higgs said, clearly straining. From the front row came Samuel's voice, clear, calm, not yelling, not bitter. And my name? Was that a joke too? For a moment, Higgs looked at him, and for the first time, his gaze wasn't condescending. It wasn't superior. It wasn't cold. It was simply still. He didn't answer. The hearing ended without applause. There were no raised voices, no shouting, just silence. The kind that meant something had cracked. Maybe not shattered, but cracked enough for the light to get in. 1 week later, the commission released its official statement. Judge Walter Higgs is hereby suspended from judicial duties pending a full investigation into conduct violations. Interim measures will be enacted immediately. One blogger put it like this: the age when a robe could shield a rotten core is coming to a close. And Samuel, he didn't celebrate. He didn't throw a fist in the air or call the press. Instead, he stood outside Caleb's middle school at 3:15 p.m., leaning against the chain-link fence as kids poured out like water. Caleb spotted him, ran up with his backpack bouncing behind him, face lit with the kind of joy that can only come from trust. Is it true? Caleb asked. Did they really suspend him? Samuel knelt, looked him straight in the eye, and nodded. Yes, it's true. Because of you? The boy asked. Because of us, Samuel said. And because our name isn't a joke. Not anymore. A week later, they were back in court, but this time the judge was someone new, young, calm, with eyes that actually made contact, and a voice that didn't drip sarcasm with every sentence. Mr. Quaddy, the judge said, flipping through the file, everything's in order. Custody is approved. Congratulations. Samuel didn't smile right away. He just exhaled, deep, full, as if he'd been carrying something enormous on his back and could finally sit down for the first time in years. Caleb reached out, grabbed his brother's hand, and squeezed it. That night, back in their kitchen with pizza on the table and dishes stacked in the sink, Caleb asked the question, why didn't you quit? Samuel looked at him, at the boy he'd fought for, at the life they'd rebuilt one paycheck, one form, one morning at a time. He shrugged, quiet for a moment. Because when we stay quiet, they win. But when we speak, they remember who we are. And that was the truth. One name, one voice, one man who refused to be laughed off the record and who made the system finally listen.